while Joe Biden may not have been the progressive choice in the Democratic primary, he is running on the most progressive platform in the modern history of the Democratic Party.
I'm Malika Bilal, and I'm here with Waleed Shahid, Communications Director for Justice Democrats, because we need to talk. Talk about an October surprise, a COVID outbreak among the Trump administration, including the diagnoses of the president and the first lady themselves. What does this mean for the Trump campaign going forward?
I think that they're in a lot of trouble because it symbolizes in so many ways that the ways that the Trump administration has not taken the pandemic seriously, whether on a public health level or an economic level. And now it's reached literally their front door and is affecting everyone around them. And so in some ways, it's Shakespearean of how symbolic this moment is to the country, that for so many months he was pretending this wasn't a crisis. And then when it became a crisis, blaming everyone around him who is an expert. And in so many ways that he has not even taken the head of the CDC's advice on the pandemic. And so the fact that the biggest crisis in the world, the president himself cannot seem to handle it, and the people around him, doesn't inspire much confidence that he should be the president of the United States anymore.
Can this actually be called an October surprise, or is this something that any of us could have seen coming?
I don't know if we could have seen it coming to this extent where so many people around him are also getting the virus, but it's not surprising that we've seen the president for months making fun of other people wearing masks, even at the debate. Literally the day that he gets the virus himself, that he is making fun of how large Joe Biden's mask is, even though it's the exact same size that most other people's masks are. So the level to which, I think the most surprising thing is the way that he has flip-flopped and canceled the talks on stimulus, that you would think that the president would want to do something to improve people's economic situations before an election, and instead is focusing on the most political part of it, which is the Supreme Court.
The coronavirus is now threatening the Republican Party's plan to confirm Amy Coney Barrett, with the outbreak potentially stemming from an event at the White House to introduce her. Where do you see this going?
I think this is a real conversation about what kind of democracy we want to live in. And so, Republicans did not allow President Obama to nominate Merrick Garland in 2016. Then they were able to, without winning the popular vote in this country, were able to get Neil Gorsuch and an embattled Brett Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court. And now they're trying to, at the last minute, flip-flop on their own principle from 2016, that during an election year, their principle was during an election year, you do not make Supreme Court nominations. And now they're going back on that and saying that they will make a court nomination despite the precedent that they set. And so the conversation opens up, when it comes to things like that President Biden hopefully wants to do, will a Trump-appointed 6-3 Supreme Court shut down our expansion of voting rights, shut down expansion of healthcare, shut down our expansion of immigrant rights, shut down what we want to do on the climate or to combat oligarchy? And so there's a number of things on the table, whether that's expanding the court or reforming how we make nominations to the Supreme Court. But the way that we currently handle Supreme Court nominations does not make sense, and is become outdated in the way that it's become a political football. Doesn't help create the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the eyes of the American public. It doesn't help with making laws happen.
A Morning Consult poll shows that in July, voters viewed Biden as more liberal than they did in the beginning of the year. How would you compare Vice President Joe Biden with previous Democratic nominees for president?
Well, he is interesting because, President Obama in 2008 ran on a campaign of hope and change, and in many ways he took on the establishment of his time, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In terms of 2020, Joe Biden's campaign is really about leadership that you can trust, human decency, and honestly, like the baseline of what you might want a president in either party to uphold, which is that he cares about all Americans regardless of their party and wants to improve people's lives. And so while Joe Biden may not have been the progressive choice in the Democratic primary, he is running on the most progressive platform in the modern history of the Democratic Party. His platform is much more progressive than Barack Obama's or Hillary Clinton's. And that's due to the work of organizers and activists and elected officials like the members of the Squad and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Are you celebrating, though? Because I hear the qualifier. It's more progressive than the Obama administration. But can you really be called progressive if your platform does not include the Green New Deal, does not include Medicare for all, does not include canceling tuition?
Yeah, I don't think that Joe Biden considers himself part of the progressive wing of the party that, Bernie Sanders or AOC or Elizabeth Warren is a part of. But, if you think about the historic perspective, you know, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. FDR was not a socialist or a trade unionist. LBJ was not a civil rights activist. In fact, the most transformative presidents in American history, you know, kept these movements of their times at arm's length, but those movements still did the work of organizing and shaping public opinion and pressuring the presidents of their time to act on the biggest questions of the era. And I hope that President Biden, if he is elected president, which I hope he is, will be able to be shaped by these movements, whether the movements for Black Lives Matter or the climate movement or student debt cancellation or Medicare for all, that these movements still have to do the work of putting pressure on him after November if he's elected and throughout his presidency. I did not vote for Joe Biden in the primary, and I didn't support, and I campaigned against him. I was not happy with the result of the primary. I wanted Bernie Sanders to win. That said, the choice is basically a binary choice now between a candidate who has been willing to work with progressives, who has a plan to improve people's lives, and then a candidate who has no interest in improving people's lives and is actively tearing apart the fabric of our democracy and our economy as we speak.
According to a 2019 Gallup poll, only 24% of Americans identify as liberals. Is the liberal left out of touch with the majority of the country?
I think many voters, especially on the Democratic side, don't strongly identify with ideological labels. Republicans constantly talk about what it means to be a conservative, and being a conservative is a huge part of Republican identity. That is not necessarily true of how Democrats talk about being a liberal or being a progressive or even being a socialist. That is not necessarily how voters even conceive themselves. There are many voters who voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020 who consider themselves conservatives or moderates and not liberals or progressives. And so I think one of the things that is actually true about voters is how they identify, not on a left-right spectrum, but on a top versus bottom spectrum. Do they think that the economy or the political system is rigged for people at the top? Do they think that democracy doesn't actually work? And, one of the things my organization does is work on Democratic primaries, where frequently in Democratic primaries, the candidates we run are from the bottom of the party, people of color, working class candidates, women, people like AOC or Jamal Bowman or Cori Bush, who show that the party could be much more representative than many of the people in Congress today. I mean, 50% of Congress is literally millionaires. And the top of the party tends to look a lot more like people like Chuck Schumer or Dianne Feinstein or Nancy Pelosi than people like Cori Bush or AOC or Jamal Bowman. So, my whole organization is about realigning the Democratic Party and making sure it's accountable to its voters, not corporate donors, and making the case that the party could be more responsive to people at the bottom and less out of touch.
So I hear what you're saying about labels. I'm going to posit something else back to you, though. This is according to the Pew Research Center. 55% of white Democratic voters identify themselves as liberals, compared to only 29% of Black and 37% of Hispanic Democratic voters. Is there a disconnect there? And why aren't progressive policies seeming to resonate with these communities?
Yeah, I would push back on that. I mean, I think of the own case of my parents. My parents are religious, they are Democrats. And if you ask them if they are conservative, moderate, or liberal, they would say they're conservative. And they voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016 and in 2020 because Sanders was someone who's fighting for working families like them. And they believed in him. They felt that he was authentic. And so, that's just a case from my own life story and my own family. But I do think that there are, we tend to look at the presidential election as the only thing that matters when it comes to questions like the ones you're raising. If you look at Jamal Bowman's race, he was able to win over the support of Black voters, Latino voters, white voters against an incumbent on a platform of Medicare for all and single-payer healthcare, of Green New Deal, of major reforms to the police department to reallocate resources towards social services and not just punitive punishment. And so in that district, Jamal Bowman was able to be the messenger who could rally people around a progressive message. In AOC's district, she was able to win a majority of Latino and Latino voters in that district on a similar platform. So I don't think the case of the presidential election is necessarily the only one.
Many young voters don't believe that Trump will willingly leave the office if he loses. How concerned are you about statements from President Trump on challenging the election outcome?
I'm really concerned. I think that, President Trump is an authoritarian. I'm scared that he's not better at being an authoritarian, that he's so incompetent that, there could be another Republican who's actually more efficient and more disciplined about doing what we've seen done in other countries where democracies have backslid. I worry about the message that, Donald Trump is hijacking the election or corrupting the election, that we've seen in poll after poll, that message actually makes Democratic voters less likely to vote because they're like, what's the point of voting if Donald Trump is already going to hijack this? And so we have to be careful about how we talk about it. That said, when it comes to the tactics of what happens in November, we have to make sure that, all votes are counted, every person counts, that mail-in votes count, and that, we deploy every tool, legal, political, people on the streets to make sure that the integrity of the election, whatever the result, is upheld. And the biggest way to send a signal about what direction we need to head in is by having people vote in record numbers to vote out Trump. The bigger the margin, the less likely Trump is going to be able to, rally his base or rally lawyers or rally whoever to convince them that the election was somehow rigged by Democrats.
What happens to the Democratic Party if Donald Trump gets reelected?
Well, I think a lot of it will be around what, a postmortem on what happened with the Biden candidacy if he were to lose. I think people look at whether or not he was the right candidate for the right time. All these questions that happened with Hillary Clinton, people came to different conclusions, some of which I disagree with, some of which I agree with about why she didn't win. There's also a larger conversation to have that isn't about Joe Biden at all, but about the Electoral College, about what states are privileged in our voting system, about, what voters have power. And so, a lot of it might not actually be about the rifts in the party as much as whether the system actually functions to be able to give a majority a say in our democracy, or whether we're increasingly becoming a country where minority rule is the way of democracy.
Waleed, where does the time go? That's all the time we have for now, but thank you so much for being here. And thank you for joining me on We Need to Talk. Lots more to discuss, so we'll have to do it in the comments. Let me know what you think. And for all the latest news on the U.S. election, head over to aljazeera.com/simply2020. See you next time.